people that the economy and the stock market is sound.
The bankers knew they had to do something to avert a total financial meltdown. A Times journalist watched events unfold.
The crowd grew thicker and noisier, and then there was an eddy in the middle of it, and a man in shirt sleeves was pushing his way across the street in the direction of the Morgan offices. This was Charles E. Mitchell, chairman of the National City Bank. He pushed his way into the offices of the House of Morgan, and a little later, we learned what he'd gone for.
Charles Mitchell had been summoned to a meeting at the offices of J.P. Morgan. Around the table were 4 other leading bankers, including Richard Whitney, vice president of the New York Stock Exchange. These were some of the wealthiest businessmen in America, representing around $6 billion in assets. Chairman was Thomas Lamont.
I think it was a great shock to Grandfather. He did not foresee that anything like the great crash that took place would happen. Grandfather called a meeting at his office at 23 Wall Street of some of the leading bankers in town and figured out what they could do to support the stock market, which was plunging. What they came up with was a plan to put together a pool of $250 million. And those funds would be used to support a key list of stocks.
At lunchtime, Richard Whitney marched across the street back to the trading floor of the stock exchange. With a huge injection of the bankers' cash, Whitney hoped to get the market moving again.
Whitney parades over to the desk where U.S. Steel is being sold and buys 25,000 shares of U.S. Steel at a price well above what it was then selling for, and then makes a similar promenade to other blue chip stocks and makes a similar purchase. The idea being we will now restore everybody's confidence in the market. And other great financial titans of the time, including John D. Rockefeller, make similar purchases, hoping that this symbolic act will turn the tide.
And it worked. Such was the magical power of the Whitney name and the Morgan name that stocks suddenly turned around and started to go up.
By now, news of the meeting had leaked out, and journalists were desperate for information.
Grandfather was meeting with a group of reporters who were assembled on Wall Street outside of his bank office. His style was always to stay calm and never say anything that would that would erode people's confidence in the stock market.
Silver-haired Mr. Lamont received us with a manner so reassuring. It was like the man who comes on the stage of a burning theater and urges everyone to keep perfectly cool, stating there is no cause for alarm. There has been a little distressed selling on the stock exchange, and we have held a meeting to discuss the situation. We have found that there are no houses in difficulty, and margins are being maintained satisfactorily.
Grandfather and many others felt that the worst was over, but they were very, very wrong.
Over the weekend, the bankers' interventions seemed to have worked. Trading on Friday and Saturday was calm and uneventful. President Hoover also tried to steady nerves by repeating a mantra that has been used during market crashes many times since.
The fundamental business of the country, that is production and distribution of commodities, is on a sound and prosperous basis.
But in the offices of the financial district, there was total chaos.
One of the things that we forget is how primitive the technology was. So many stocks traded on October 24th that it took 4 hours for the ticker to print all of the stock trades after the market had closed.
The ticker, hopelessly swamped, fell hours behind the actual trading and became completely meaningless. All night long, the lights blazed in the windows of the tall office buildings, where margin clerks and bookkeepers struggled with the desperate task of trying to clear one day's business before the next day began. They fainted at their desks. The weary runner fell exhausted on the marble floors of banks and slept.
On Monday, with stock tickers running out of tape, panicking investors desperate for the latest share prices jammed the telephone lines between New York and other major cities. For the first time, many speculators were discovering the downside of easy credit and buying on margin.
A fairly significant number of people who were buying stocks in the 1920s were buying it with borrowed money. And of course, the wonder of buying stocks with borrowed money is that the gains are tremendously accelerated and magnified on the way up. And then, of course, on the way down, the entire machinery is thrown into reverse and the losses are also magnified.
All these people who had borrowed to buy stock now had to put up more collateral. And this was something that had not happened as the market had gone up and up. You've got $25 down for $100 stock, but now if the stock has dropped. So what happened is the brokerages that had made all these loans got very concerned that the loans wouldn't be paid back. People got calls to bring in more cash or their stocks would be sold.
Account needs $600. Unless this amount received before 1 p.m. Tuesday, we'll sell all securities in your account. Consider this notice to that effect.
And that's a difficult thing to do. Some people didn't have additional cash to bring in, or they took them some time perhaps to do it, but the brokers were very uneasy. They couldn't wait. And so Monday, the market begins to fall even at a steeper rate than it fell on Thursday. In fact, this would turn out to be one of the very worst days ever in the history of the United States stock market.
1929, when the stock market crashed, I was a very young lady, just 7 years old. However, I do remember bits and pieces of that day very clearly in my memory. We didn't have many means of communication. And when something extraordinary happened, the papers would put out an extra, that's what it was called, an extra, for 2 cents. And the little boys in their little pea caps would come running through the streets, screaming, "Extra, extra, read all about it." And invariably somebody in the house would go down and buy a daily for 2 cents, and then we would know what happened. And that's how we found out about the crash.
At the time, Vera was with a family friend, but news came that the friend's aunt had lost everything.
The little lady was crying quietly. She was crying quietly and wringing her hands and walking from room to room to room. So that was my actual memory of that day.
On Tuesday morning, some of the most famous names in corporate America saw their share price plummet. US Steel, Radio, General Motors, stocks that had been symbols of the boom years.
On Tuesday, there were tremendous waves of selling that just kept coming. This time, the selling was so powerful and so relentless, there was no lunchtime meeting at JP Morgan. Clearly, the volume of the sales overwhelmed any possibility of the bankers trying to stem the tide.
By evening Tuesday, all American stocks were worth about 22% less than they were when the market opened in the morning on Monday. 36 hours, you lost 22% of the value of American industry.
Hoover was president, and he and Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury, were way to the right and felt that it was not the government's job to interfere with this. They believed in pure, unfettered capitalism, and so they did very little or nothing to alleviate the crash. They said it'll solve itself. The market broke very sharply, and a lot of people were wiped out with it. It was very painful. Almost everybody lost money, as has happened now.
Oh, the market's not so good today. Your stocks look kinda sick. In fact, they all drop down a point each time the tickers tick.
It's estimated that by the end of these 5 days trading, $25 billion worth of personal wealth had simply